Section 1 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abai in January 2014. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First part, Chapter 1, Part 1, Astronomers and Cartographers. Cassini, Picard and La Hire, The Arc of the Meridian and the Map of France, G. Delisle and D'Anville, The Shape of the Earth, Maupertuis in Lapland, Condamine at the Equator. Before we enter upon a recital of the great expeditions of the 18th century, we shall do well to chronicle the immense progress made during that period by the sciences. They rectified a crowd of prejudices and established a solid basis for the labors of astronomers and geographers. If we refer them solely to the matter before us, they radically modified cartography and ensured for navigation a security hitherto unknown. Although Galileo had observed the eclipses of Jupiter's satellites as early as 1610, his important discovery had been rendered useless by the indifference of governments, the inadequacy of instruments, and the mistakes committed by his followers. In 1660, Jean-Dominique Cassini published his Tables of the Satellites of Jupiter, which induced Colbert to send for him in the following year, and which obtained for him the superintendence of the Paris Observatory. In the month of July 1671, Philippe de la Hire went to Uraniborg in the island of Huen to take observations for the situation of Tycho Brahe's observatory. In that spot he calculated with the assistance of Cassini's tables, and with an exactitude never before obtained, the difference between the longitudes of Paris and Uraniborg. The Academy of Sciences sent the astronomer Jean Richter the same year to Cayenne to study the parallaxes of the Sun and Moon, and to determine the distance of Mars and Venus from the Earth. This voyage, which was entirely successful, was attended with unforeseen consequences, and resulted in inquiries shortly after entered into as to the shape of the earth. Richter noticed that the pendulum lost 2 minutes 28 seconds at Cayenne, which proved that the momentum was less at this place than at Paris. From this fact Newton and Huygens deduced the flatness of the globe at the poles. Shortly afterwards, however, the computation of a terrestrial degree given by Abbé Picard, and the determination of the meridional arc arrived at by the Cassinis, father and son, led scientific men to an entirely different result, and induced them to consider the earth an elliptical figure, elongated towards the polar regions. Passionate discussions arose from this decision, and in them originated immense undertakings, from which astronomical and mathematical geography profited. Picard undertook to estimate the space contained between the parallels of Amiens and Malvoisine, which comprises a degree and a third. The Academy, however, decided that a more exact result could be obtained by the calculation of a greater distance, and determined to portion out the entire length of France from north to south in degrees. For this purpose they selected the meridian line which passes the Paris Observatory. This gigantic trigonometrical undertaking was commenced 20 years before the end of the 17th century, was interrupted and recommenced, and finally finished towards 1720. At the same time Louis XIV, urged by Colbert, gave orders for the preparation of a map of France. Men of science undertook voyages from 1679 to 1682, and by astronomical observations found the position of the coasts on the ocean and Mediterranean. But even these undertakings, Picard's computation of the meridional arc, the calculations which determined the latitude and longitude of certain large cities in France, and a map which gave the environs of Paris in detail with geometrical exactitude, were still insufficient data for a map of France. As in the measurement of the meridional arc, the only course to adopt was to cover the whole extent of the country with a network of triangles. Such was the basis of the large map of France which justly bears the name of Cassini. The result of the early observations of Cassini and La Hire was to restrict France within much narrower limits than had hitherto been assigned to her. Desborough Cooley, in his History of Voyages, says, "They deprived her (France) of several degrees of longitude in the length of her western coast from Brittany to the Bay of Biscay, and in the same way retrenched about half a degree from Languedoc and La Provence." These alterations gave rise to a bon mot. Louis XIV, in complimenting the academicians upon their return, remarked, "I am sorry to see, gentlemen, that your journey has cost me a good part of my kingdom." So far, however, cartographers had ignored the corrections made by astronomers. In the middle of the 17th century, Peiresc and Gassendi had corrected upon the maps of the Mediterranean a difference of 500 miles of distance between Marseilles and Alexandria. Jean-Mathieu de Chazelles, who had assisted Cassini in his labours, was sent to the Levant to draw up a coast chart for the Mediterranean. "It was sufficiently clear," say the Memoirs of the Academy of Sciences, "that the maps unduly extended the continents of Europe, Africa, and America, and narrowed the Pacific Ocean between Asia and Europe. These errors had caused singular mistakes. During M. de Chaumont's voyage, when he went as Louis XIV's ambassador to Siam, the pilots, trusting to their charts, were mistaken in their calculations, and both in going and in returning went a good deal further than they imagined. In proceeding from the Cape of Good Hope to the island of Java, they imagined themselves a long way from the Strait of Sunda, when in reality they were more than 60 leagues beyond it. And they were forced to put back for 2 days with a favourable wind to enter it. In the same way, upon their return voyage from the Cape of Good Hope to France, they found themselves at the island of Flores, the most western of the Azores, when they conceived themselves to be at least 150 leagues eastward of it. They were obliged to navigate for 12 days in an easterly direction in order to reach the French coast. As we have already said, the corrections made in the map of France were considerable. It was recognized that Perpignan and Collioure more especially were far more to the east than had been supposed. To gain a fair idea of the alteration, one has only to glance at the map of France published in the first part of the 7th volume of the Memoirs of the Academy of Sciences. All the astronomical observations to which we have called attention are noted in it, and the original outline of the map, published by Sanson in 1679, makes the modification apparent. Cassini was right in saying that cartography was no longer at its height as a science. In reality, Sanson had blindly followed the longitudes of Ptolemy without taking any note of astronomical observations. His sons and grandsons had simply re-edited his maps as they were completed, and other geographers followed the same course. William de L'Isle was the first to construct new maps, and to make use of modern discoveries. He arbitrarily rejected all that had been done before this time. His enthusiasm was so great that he had entirely carried out his project at the age of 25. His brother, Joseph Nicholas, who taught astronomy in Russia, sent William materials for his maps. At the same time his younger brother, de L'Isle de la Cuillère, visited the coast of the Arctic Ocean, and astronomically fixed the position of the most important points. He embarked on board the Bering's vessel, and died at Kamtchatka. That was the work of the 3 de L'Isle, but to William belongs the glory of having revolutionized geography. He succeeded, says Cooley, in reconciling ancient and modern computations, and in collecting an immense mass of documents. Instead of limiting his corrections to any one quarter of the earth, he directed them to the entire globe. By this means he earned the right to be considered the founder of modern geography. Peter the Great, on his way to Paris, paid a tribute to his merit by visiting him, and placing at his disposal all the information he himself possessed of the geography of Russia. Could there be a more conclusive testimony to his worth than this from a stranger? And if French geographers are excelled in these days by those of Germany and England, is it not consolatory and encouraging to them to know that they have excelled in a science in which they are now struggling to regain their former superiority? Delisle lived to witness the success of his pupil, J.B. d'Anville. If the latter is inferior to Adrien Valois in the matter of historical science, he deserved his high fame for the relative improvement of his outlines, and for the clear and artistic appearance of his maps. It is difficult, says M.E. Desjardins in his Géographie de la Gaule romaine, to understand the slight importance which has been attributed to his works as a geographer, mathematician, and draftsman. The latter more especially do justice to his great merit. D'Anville was the first to construct a map by scientific methods, and that of itself is sufficient glory. In the department of historical geography, D'Anville exhibited unusual good sense in discussion, and a marvelous topographical instinct for identifications, but it is well to remember that he was neither a man of science, nor even well versed in classic authorities. His most beautiful work is his map of Italy, the dimensions of which, hitherto exaggerated, extended from the east to the west in accordance with the ideas of the ancients. In 1735, Philippe Buache, whose name as a geographer is justly celebrated, inaugurated a new method in his chart of the depths of the English Channel, by using contour levels to represent the variations of the soil. 10 years later, D'Après de Mannevillette published his Neptune Oriental, in which he rectified the charts of the African, Chinese, and Indian coasts. He added to it a nautical guide, which was the more precious at this period, as it was the first of the kind. Up to the close of his life he amended his manual, which served as a guide for all French naval officers during the latter part of the 18th century. Of English astronomers and physicists, Halley was the chief. He published a theory of magnetic variations and a history of the monsoons, which gained for him the command of a vessel, that he might put his theory into practice. That which D'Après achieved for the French, Alexander Dalrymple accomplished for the English. His views, however, bordered on the hypothetical, and he believed in the existence of an Antarctic continent. He was succeeded by Horsburgh, whose name is justly dear to navigators. We must now speak of two important expeditions which ought to have settled the animated discussion as to the shape of the earth. The Academy of Sciences had dispatched a mission to America to compute the arc of the meridian at the equator. It was composed of Gaudin, Bouguer, and La Condamine. It was decided to entrust a similar expedition to the north to Maupertuis. "If," said this scientific man, "the flatness of the earth be not greater than Huygens supposed, the margin between the degrees of the meridian the imperfection of instruments. But if the observation can be made at the pole, the difference between the first degree of the meridian nearest the equatorial line, and, for example, the 66th degree, which crosses the polar circle, will be great enough, even by Huygens' hypothesis, to show itself irresistibly, and beyond the possibility of miscalculation, because the difference would be repeated just as many times as there are intermediate degrees." The problem thus neatly propounded ought to have obtained a ready solution both at the pole and the equator, a solution which would have settled the discussion by proving Huygens and Newton to be right. The expedition embarked in a vessel equipped at Dunkerque. In addition to Maupertuis, it comprised Declercq, Camus, and Lemonnier, academicians, Albert Autier, canon of Bayeux, a secretary named Sommereux, a draftsman, Herbelot, and the scientific Swedish astronomer, Celsius. When the King of Sweden received the members of the mission at Stockholm, he said to them, "I have been in many bloody battles, but I should prefer finding myself in the midst of the most sanguinary rather than join your expedition." Certainly it was not likely to prove a party of pleasure. The learned adventurers were to be tested by difficulties of every kind, by continued privation, by excessive cold. But what comparison can be made between their sufferings, and the agonies, the trials, and the dangers which were to be encountered by the Arctic explorers, Ross, Parry, Hall, Payer, and many others? Damiron, in his Eulogy of Maupertuis, says, "The houses at Tornea, north of the Gulf of Bothnia, almost in the Arctic Circle, are hidden under the snow. When one goes out, the air seems to pierce the lungs, the increasing degrees of frost are proclaimed by the incessant crackling of the wood, of which most of the houses are built. From the solitude which reigns in the streets, one might fancy that the inhabitants of the town were dead. At every step one meets mutilated figures, people who have lost arms or legs from the terrible severity of the temperature. And yet the travellers did not intend pausing at Tornea." Nowadays these portions of the globe are better known, and the region of the Arctic climate thoroughly appreciated, which makes it easier to estimate the difficulties the inquirers encountered. They commenced their operations in July 1736. Beyond Tornea they found only uninhabited regions. They were obliged to rely upon their own resources for scaling the mountains, where they placed the signals intended to form the uninterrupted series of triangles. Divided into two parties in order to thus obtain two measurements instead of one, and thereby also to diminish the chance of mistakes, the adventurous savants, after inconceivable hairbreadth escapes, of which an account can be found in the Memoirs of the Academy of Sciences for 1737, and after incredible efforts, decided that the length of the meridian circle, comprised between the parallels of Tornea and Kittis, was 55,023 fathoms and a half. Thus, below the polar circle, the meridian degree comprised 1,000 fathoms more than Cassini had imagined, and the terrestrial degree exceeded by 377 fathoms the length which Picard has reckoned it between Paris and Amiens. The result, therefore, of this discovery, a result long repudiated by the Cassinis, both father and son, was that the earth was considerably flattened at the poles. Voltaire somewhat maliciously said of it, "Courrier de la physique, argonaute nouveau, qui, franchissant les monts, qui, traversant les eaux, ramenez les climats soumis aux trois couronnes, vos perches, vos secteurs et surtout de Lapone. Vous avez confirmé dans ces lieux pleins de nuit ce que Newton connut sans sortir de lui." In much the same vein he alludes to the two sisters who accompanied Maupertuis upon his return, the attractions of one of whom proved irresistible. "Cette erreur est trop ordinaire, et c'est la seule que l'on fit en allant au cercle polaire." M. A. Maury, in his History of the Academy of Sciences, remarks, "At the same time, the importance of the instruments and methods employed by the astronomers sent to the north afforded a support to the defenders of the theory of the flattening of the globes, which was hardly theirs by right, and in the following century the Swedish astronomer Svanborg rectified their involuntary exaggerations in a fine work published by him in the French language. Meantime, the mission dispatched by the Academy to Peru proceeded with analogous operations. It consisted of La Condamine, Bouguer, and Gaudin, 3 academicians, Joseph de Jussieu, governor of the Medical College, who undertook the botanical branch, Sénerguet, a surgeon, Gaudin de Odonais, a clockmaker, and a draftsman. They started from La Rochelle on the 16th of May, 1735. Upon reaching St. Domingo, they took several astronomical observations, and continued by way of Portobello and Carthagena. Crossing the Isthmus of Panama, they disembarked at Manta in Peru, upon the 9th of March, 1736. Arrived there, Bouguer and Condamine parted from their companions, studied the rapidity of the pendulum, and finally reached Quito by different routes. Condamine pursued his way along the coast as far as Rio de las Esmeraldas, and drew the map of the entire country, which he traversed with such infinite toil. Bouguer went southwards towards Guayaquil, passing through marshy forests, and reaching Caracol at the foot of the Cordillera range of the Andes, which he was a week in crossing. This route had been previously taken by Alvarado when 70 of his followers perished, amongst them the 3 Spaniards who had attempted to penetrate to the interior. Bouguer reached Quito on the 10th of June. At that time this city contained between 30 and 40,000 inhabitants, and boasted of an episcopal president of the assembly, and numbers of religious communities, besides 2 colleges. Living there was cheap, with the exception of foreign merchandises, which realized exorbitant prices, so much so indeed that a glass goblet fetched from 18 to 20 francs. The adventurers scaled the Pichincha, a mountain near Quito, the eruptions from which had more than once been fatal to the inhabitants, but they were not slow in discovering that they could not succeed in carrying their implements to the summit of the mountains, and that they must be satisfied with placing the signals upon the hills. An extraordinary phenomenon may be witnessed almost every day upon the summit of these mountains, said Bouguer in the account he read before the Academy of Sciences, which is probably as old as the world itself, but what it appeared was never witnessed by any one before us. We first remarked it when we were all together upon a mountain called Pambamarca. A cloud in which we had been enveloped, and which dispersed, allowed us a view of the rising sun, which was very brilliant. The cloud passed on, it was scarcely removed 30 paces, when each of us distinguished his own shadow reflected above him, and saw only his own, because the cloud presented a broken surface. The short distance allowed us fully to recognize each part of the shadow. We distinguished the arms, the legs, the head, but we were most amazed at finding that the latter was surrounded by a glory, or aureole formed of 2 or 3 small concentric crowns of a very bright color, containing the same variety of hues as the rainbow, red being the outer one. The spaces between the circles were equal, the last circle the weakest, and in the far distance we perceived one large white one, which surrounded the whole. It produced the effect of a transfiguration upon the spectator. The instruments employed by these scholars were not as accurate as more modern ones, and varied with changes of temperature, in consequence of which they were forced to proceed most carefully and with most minute accuracy, lest small errors accumulating should end by leading to greater ones. Thus, in their trigonometrical surveys, Bouguer and his associates never calculated the 3rd angle by the observation of the 2 first, but always observed all 3. Having calculated the number of fathoms contained in the extent of country surveyed, the next point was to discover what part this was of the earth's circumference, which could only be ascertained by means of astronomical observations. After numerous obstacles, which it is impossible to give in detail, After curious discoveries, as for example the attraction exercised on the pendulum by mountains, the French inquirers arrived at conclusions which fully confirmed the result of the expedition to Lapland. They did not all return to France at the same time. Jussieu continued his search after facts in natural history, and La Condamine decided to return by way of the Amazon River, making an important voyage, to which we shall have occasion to refer later. End of section 1.
Section 2 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 2. Great Navigators of the 18th Century, by Jules Verne. First Part, Chapter 1, Part 2. Voyages in the 18th Century. Expedition of Wood Rogers. Adventures of Alexander Selkirk. Galapagos Island. Puerto Seguro. Return to England. Expedition of George Anson. Staten Island. Juan Fernandez. Tinian. Macao. Taking of the vessel. Canton River. Results of the cruise. The War of the Spanish Succession was at its height, when some privateers of Bristol determined to fit out ships to attack the Spanish vessels in the Pacific Ocean, and to devastate the coast of South America. The two vessels chosen, the Duke and Duchess, under Captain Rogers and Courtenay, were carefully equipped and stocked with everything necessary for so long a voyage. The famous Dampier, who had acquired a great reputation by his daring adventures and piracies, did not disdain to accept the title of chief pilot, and although this trip was richer in material results than in geographical discoveries, the account of it contains a few curious particulars worthy of preservation. The Duke and Duchess set sail from the royal port of Bristol on the 2nd of April, 1708. To begin with, we may note one interesting fact. Throughout the voyage a register was at the service of the crew, in which all the incidents of the voyage were to be noted, so that the slightest error and the most insignificant oversights could be rectified before the facts of the case faded from memory. Nothing of note occurred on this voyage till the 22nd of December, when the Falkland Islands, previously noticed by few navigators, were discovered. Rogers did not land on them, but contented himself by observing that the coast, although less precipitous, resembled that of Portland. All the hills, he added, with their well-wooded and gradually sloping sides, appeared fertile, and the shore is not wanting in good harbours. Now these islands do not possess a single tree, and the good harbours, as we shall presently see, are anything but numerous, so we can judge of the exactitude of the observations made by Rogers. Navigators have done well not to trust to them. After passing this archipelago, the two vessels steered due south, and penetrated as far as south latitude 60 degrees 58 minutes. Here there was no night, the cold was intense, and the sea so rough that the Duchess sustained a few injuries. The chief officers of the two vessels assembled in council, agreeing that it would be better not to attempt to go further south, and the course was changed for the west. On the 15th of January 1709, Cape Horn is said to have been doubled, and the Southern Ocean entered. Up to this date the position of the island of Juan Fernandez was differently given on nearly all maps, and Wood Rogers, who intended to harbour there, take in water, and get a little fresh meat, came upon it almost unawares. On the 1st of February he embarked in a little boat to try and find an anchorage. Whilst his people were awaiting his return, a large fire was noticed on shore. Had some Spanish or French vessels cast anchor here? Would it be necessary to fight for the water and food required? Every preparation was made during the night, but in the morning no ship was in sight. Conjectures were already being hazarded as to whether the enemy had retired, when the end was put to all surmises by the return of the boat, bringing in it a man clad in goatskins, whose personal appearance was yet more savage than his garments. It was a Scotch mariner, Alexander Selkirk by name, who, in consequence of a quarrel with the captain of his ship, had been left on this desert island 4 years and a half before. The fire which had attracted notice had been lighted by him. During his stay on the island of Juan Fernandez, Selkirk had seen many vessels pass, but only 2, both Spanish, had cast anchor. Discovered by the sailors, Selkirk had been fired upon, and only escaped death by the agility with which he managed to climb into a tree and hide. He told how he had been put ashore with his clothes, his bed, a pound of powder, some bullets, a little tobacco, a hatchet, a knife, a kettle, a Bible, with a few other devotional books, his nautical instruments and books. Poor Selkirk provided for his wants as best he could, but during the first few months he had great difficulty in conquering the sadness and mastering the horror consequent upon his terrible loneliness. He built 2 huts of willow, which he covered with a sort of rush, and lined with the skins of the goats he killed to satisfy his hunger, as long as his ammunition lasted. When it was likely to fail, he managed to strike a light by rubbing 2 pieces of pimento wood together. When he had quite exhausted his ammunition, he caught the goats as they ran. His agility had become so great by dint of constant exercise that he scoured the woods, rocks, and hills with a perfectly incredible speed. He had sufficient proof of his skill when he went hunting with us. He outran and exhausted our best hunters, and an excellent dog which we had on board. He easily caught the goats, and brought them to us on his back. He himself related to us that one day he chased his prey so eagerly to the edge of a precipice, which was concealed by bushes, that they rolled over and over together, until they reached the bottom. He lost consciousness through that fall, and upon discovering that the goat lay under him quite dead, after remaining where he was for 24 hours, he, with the utmost difficulty, succeeded in crawling to his cabin, which was about a mile distant, and he was unable to walk again for 6 days. This deserted wretch managed to season his food with the turnips sown by the crew of a ship, with cabbages, capsicums, and allspice. When his clothes and shoes were worn out, a process which occupied but a short time, he ingeniously constructed a new ones of goatskin, sewing them together with a nail, which served him as a needle. When his knife was useless, he constructed a new one from the cask hoops he found on the shore. He had so far lost the use of speech, but he could only make himself understood by an effort. Rogers took him on board, and appointed him boatswain's mate. Selkirk was not the first sailor abandoned upon the island of Juan Fernandez. It may be remembered that Dampier had already rescued an unfortunate Mosquito man, who was abandoned from 1681 to 1684. Sharp and other buccaneers have related that the sole survivor of a crew of a vessel wrecked on this coast lived there for 5 years, until he was rescued by another ship. Saintin, in his recent novel Alone, has detailed Selkirk's adventures. Upon the 14th of February, the Duke and Duchess left Juan Fernandez and commenced their operations against the Spaniards. Rogers seized Guayaquil, for which he obtained a large ransom, and captured several vessels, which however provided him with more prisoners than money. This part of his voyage concerns us but little, and a few particulars only are interesting, as, for instance, his mention of a monkey in the Gorgus Island, who was so lazy that he was nicknamed the Sluggard, and of the inhabitants of Tecames, who repulsed the newcomers with poisoned arrows and guns. He also speaks of the Galapagos Island, situated 2 degrees of northern latitude. According to Rogers, this cluster of islands was numerous, but out of them all, one only provided fresh water. Turtle doves existed there in great quantities, and tortoises and sea turtles of an extraordinary size abounded, thence the name given by the Spaniards to this group. Sea dogs also were common. One of them had the temerity to attack Rogers. "I was walking along the shore," he says, "when it left the water, his jaws gaping, as quickly and ferociously as a dog escaping from his chain. 3 times he attacked me. I plunged my pike into his breast, and each time I inflicted such a wound that he fled howling horribly. Finally, turning towards me, he stopped to growl and show his fangs. Scarcely 24 hours earlier one of my crew had narrowly escaped being devoured by a monster of the same family. In December, Rogers repaired to Puerto Seguro, upon the Californian coast, with a Manila galleon which he had seized. Many of his men penetrated to the interior. He found large forest trees, but not the slightest appearance of culture, although smoke indicated the existence of inhabitants. The inhabitants, according to Albey Presort's History of Voyages, were straight-built and powerful, blacker than any Indian tribe hitherto met with in the Pacific Ocean seas. They had long black hair plaited, which reached below the waist. All the men went about naked, but the women wore a garment, either composed of leaves or of stuff made from them, and sometimes the skins of beasts and birds. Occasionally they wore necklaces and bracelets made of bits of wood or shells. Others adorned their necks with small red berries and pearls. Evidently they did not know how to pierce holes in them, for they notched them and joined them by a thread. They valued these ornaments so highly that they refused to change them for English necklaces of glass. Their chief anxiety was to obtain knives and useful implements. The Duke and Duchess left Porto Seguro on the 12th of January 1710, and reached the island of Guaham of the Marians in the course of 2 months. Here they revictualled, and passing by the Straits of Bhutan and Selayer reached Batavia. After a necessary delay at the latter place, and at the Cape of Good Hope, Rogers cast anchor in the Downs upon the 1st of October. In spite of Rogers' reticence with regard to the immense riches he brought with him, a good idea of their extent may be gathered from the account of ingots, vessels of silver and gold, and pearls, with which he delighted the ship owners. We now come to our account of Admiral Anson's voyage, which almost belongs to the category of naval warfare, but with it we may close the list of piratical expeditions which dishonored the victors without ruining the vanquished. And if he brought no new acquisitions to geography, his account teems with judicious observations and interesting remarks about the country then little known. The merit of them, however, if we are to believe Nichols's literary anecdotes, rests rather with Benjamin Robins, than, as the title would appear to indicate, with the chaplain of the expedition, Richard Walter. George Anson was born at Staffordshire in 1697. A sailor from his childhood, he early brought himself into notice. He was already well known as a clever and fortunate captain, when in 1739 he was offered the command of a squadron. It consisted of the Centurion, 60 guns, the Gloucester and Severe, each 50 guns, the Pearl, 40 guns, the Wager, 28 guns. To it were attached also the sloop Trial, and 2 transports carrying food and ammunition. In addition to the crew of 1,460, a reinforcement of 470 marines was added to the fleet. Leaving England on the 18th of September 1740, the expedition proceeded by way of Madeira, past the island of St. Catherine, along the Brazilian coast, by St. Julian harbour, and finally crossed the Strait of Le Maire. Terrible, said the narrative, as the aspect of Tierra del Fuego may be, that of Staten Island is more horrible still. It consists of a series of inaccessible rocks, crowned with sharp points. Prodigiously high, they are covered with eternal snow, and edged with precipices. In short, it is impossible to conceive anything more deserted and more wild than this region. Scarcely had the last vessels of the squadron filed through the strait, than a series of heavy gales, squalls, and storms caused the oldest sailors to vow that all they had hitherto known of tempests were nothing in comparison. This fearful experience lasted 7 weeks without intermission. It is needless to state that the vessels sustained great damage, that many men were swept away by the waves, numbers destroyed by illnesses occasioned by the exposure to constant damp and want of sufficient nourishment. 2 of the vessels, the Severe and the Pearl, were engulfed, and 4 others were lost sight of. Anson was unable to reach Valdivia, the rendezvous he had selected in case of separation. Carried far to the north, he could only arrest his course at Juan Fernandez, which he reached upon the 9th of June. The Centurion had the greatest need of rest. She had lost 80 of her crew, her supply of water had failed, and the sailors were so weakened by scurvy that 10 only of the remaining number were available for the watch. The other vessels, in an equally bad plight, were not long in regaining her. The first care was to restore the exhausted crews, and to repair the worst injuries sustained by the vessels. Anson sent the sick on shore, and installed them in a sheltered hospital in the open air. Then, putting himself at the head of the most enterprising sailors, he scoured the entire island, and thoroughly examined its roads and shores. The best anchorage, according to his report, was in Cumberland Bay. The south-eastern portion of Juan Fernandez, a little island scarcely 5 leagues by 2 in extent, is dry, rocky, treeless. The ground lies low, and is level in comparison with the northern portion. It produces watercresses, purslins, sorrels, turnips, and Sicilian radishes in abundance, as well as oats and clover. Anson sowed carrots and lettuces, and planted plums, apricots, and peaches. He soon discovered that the number of goats left by the buccaneers, and which had multiplied marvellously, had since decreased. The Spaniards, eager to deprive their enemies of their valuable resource, had let loose a quantity of famished dogs upon the island, who chased the goats and devoured so many of them, that at the time of Anson's visit scarcely 200 remained. The Commodore, for so Anson is always called in the narrative of this voyage, reconnoitred the island of Mas a Fuego, which is only 25 leagues west of Juan Fernandez. Smaller than the latter, it is more wooded, better watered, and possessed more goats. At the beginning of December the crews were sufficiently recovered for Anson to put into execution his projected attack upon the Spaniards. He commenced by seizing several ships, laden with precious merchandise and ingots, and then set fire to the city of Paita. Upon this occasion the Spaniards estimated their loss at 1.5 million piastres. Anson then proceeded to Quibo Bay, near Panama, to lie in wait for the galleon which every year transported the treasure of the Philippine Islands to Acapulco. Then, although the English met with no inhabitants in the miserable huts, they found heaps of shells and beautiful mother of pearl left there during the summer months by the fishermen of Panama. In mentioning the resources of this place, we must not omit the immense turtles, which usually weighed 200 pounds, and which were caught in a singular manner. When a shoal of them were seen floating asleep upon the surface of the ocean, a good swimmer would plunge in a few fathoms deep, and rising, seize the turtle towards the tail, and endeavour to force it down. Upon awakening, the creature's struggles to free itself sufficed to support both the man and his prey, until the arrival of a boat to receive them both. After a fruitless cruise, Anson determined to burn 3 of the Spanish vessels which he had seized and equipped. Distributing the crews and cargo upon the Centurion and the Gloucester, the only 2 vessels remaining to him, he decided upon the 6th of May, 1742, to make for China, where he hoped to find reinforcements and supplies. But this voyage, which he expected to accomplish in 60 days, took him fully 4 months. After a violent gale, the Gloucester, having all but foundered, and her crew being too reduced to work her, was burned. Her cargo of silver and her supplies were transshipped to the Centurion, which alone remained of all that magnificent fleet which 2 years earlier had set sail from England. Thrown out of his course far to the north, Anson discovered on the 26th of August the isles of Atanacan and Serigan, and the following day those of Saipan, Tinian, and Agnigan, which form a part of the Marian Archipelago. A Spaniard, a sergeant whom he captured in a small bark in these seas, told him that the island of Tinian was inhabited, and abounded with cattle, fowls, and excellent fruits, such as oranges, lemons, limes, breadfruit, etc. Nowhere could the Centurion have found a more welcome port for her exhausted crew, now numbering only 71 men, worn out by privations and illness, the only survivors of the 2,000 sailors who had manned the fleet at its departure. The soil of this island, says the narrative, is dry and somewhat sandy, which makes the verdure of the meadows and woods more delicate and more uniform than is usually the case in tropical climates. The ground rises gently from the English encampment to the centre of the isle, but before its greatest height is reached, one meets with sloping glade, covered with fine clover and many brilliant flowers, and bordered by beautiful fruit trees. The animals, who for the greater part of the year are the only lords of this beautiful retreat, add to its romantic charm, and contribute not a little to its marvellous appearance. Thousands of cattle may be seen grazing together in a vast meadow, and the sight is the more singular as the animals are all of a milk-white colour, with the exception of their ears, which are generally black. Although it is a desert island, the sight and sound of such a number of domestic animals rushing in crowds through the woods suggests the idea of farmhouses and villages. Truly an enchanting description, but has not the author rather drawn upon his own imagination for the charming details of his description? After so long a voyage, after so many storms, it is little to be wondered at if the verdant woods, the exuberant vegetation, and the abundance of animal life profoundly impressed the minds of Anson's companions. Well, we shall soon learn whether his successors at Tinian found it as wonderful as he did. Meanwhile, Anson was not altogether free from anxiety. It was true that his ships were repaired, but many of his men remained on land to recover their strength, and but a small number of able-bodied seamen remained on board with him. The roadstead being lined with coral, great precautions were necessary to save the cables from being cut, but in spite of them, at new moon a sudden tempest arose and broke the ship loose. The anchors held well, but the hawsers gave way, and the Centurion was carried out to sea. The thunder growled ceaselessly, and the rain fell with such violence that the signals of distress which were given by the crew were not even heard. Anson, most of his officers, and a large part of the crew, numbering 113 persons, remained on land, and found themselves deprived of the only means they possessed of leaving Tinian. Their despair was great, their consternation inexpressible. But Anson, with his energy and endless resources, soon roused his companions from their despair. One vessel, that which they had captured from the Spaniards, still remained to them, and it occurred to them to lengthen it, until it could contain them all with the necessary provisions for a voyage to China. However, after 19 days, the Centurion returned, and the English, embarking in her upon the 21st of October, were not long in reaching Macao, putting into a friendly and civilized port for the first time since their departure from England 2 years before. Macao, says Anson, formerly rich, well populated, and capable of self-defense against the Chinese government, is greatly shorn of its ancient splendor. Although still inhabited by the Portuguese, and ruled by a governor, nominated by the King of Portugal, it is at the mercy of the Chinese, who can starve the inhabitants or take possession of it, for which reasons the Portuguese governor is very careful not to offend them. Anson was forced to write an imperious letter to the Chinese governor before he could obtain permission to buy, even at high prices, the provisions and stores he required. He then publicly announced his intention of leaving for Batavia, and set sail on the 19th of April 1743. But instead of steering for the Dutch possession, he directed his course towards the Philippine Islands, where, for several days, he awaited the arrival of the galleon returning from Acapulco, laden with the proceeds of the sale of her rich cargo. These vessels usually carried 42 guns, and were manned by a crew of over 500 men. Anson had only 200 sailors, of whom 30 were but lads, but this disproportion did not deter him, for he had the expectation of rich booty, and the cupidity of his men was sufficient guarantee of their courage. "Why," asked Anson one day of his steward, "why do you no longer give us mutton for dinner? Have we eaten all the sheep we bought in China?" "Pray excuse me, Commodore," replied the steward, "but I am reserving the only 2 which remain for the captain of the galleon." No one, not even the steward, doubted of success. Anson well understood how to secure it, and the efficiency of his men compensated for their reduced numbers. The struggle was hot, the straw mats which filled the rigging of the galleon took fire, and the flames rose as high as the mizzenmast. The Spaniards found the double enemies too much. After a sharp contest of 2 hours, during which 67 of their men were killed and 84 wounded, they surrendered. It was a rich prize. 1,313,000 842 pieces of gold, and 35,682 ounces of ingot silver, with other merchandise of little value in comparison with the money. The booty, added to others, amounted to nearly 400,000 livres, without taking into account the vessels, goods, etc. of the Spaniards, which the English squadron had burned or destroyed, and which could not be reckoned at less than 600,000 livres. Anson convoyed his prize to the Canton River, where he sold it much below its value, for 6,000 piastres. He left on the 10th of December, and reached Spithead on the 15th of June, 1744, after an absence of 3 years and 9 months. He made a triumphal entry into London. The 500,000 of money, which was the result of his numerous prizes, was conveyed through the city in 32 chariots, to the sound of trumpets and beating of drums, and amidst the shouts of the people. The money was divided between himself, his officers and men. The king himself could not claim a share. Anson was created rear admiral shortly after his return, and received important commands. In 1747 he captured the Marquis de la Jonquière Taffanel, after an heroic struggle. For this exploit he was made First Lord of the Admiralty and Admiral. In 1758 he covered the attempted descent of the English near St. Malo, and died in London a short time after his return. End of Section 2.